Well, hello there and welcome back. My name is Stephanie Safarian, and you are listening to episode 230 of the Sustainable Minimalist Podcast, a twice weekly show about intentional and eco minimalist living. On today's show, we are discussing a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and it is, of course, coffee. How can we make the world a slightly better place by tweaking the routines that we have in place around our morning cup, or in my case, morning cups, plural, of coffee? Now, most people don't really think about coffee, right? They just like what they like. There's a ritual and a routine associated with drinking that cup or cups. But today I am speaking with somebody much smarter than me all about coffee and how we can think about the environmental implications associated with that morning cup. So today I'm speaking with David Sells. David is the co-founder of Better Grounds, a coffee subscription service. We're going to talk about coffee, we're going to talk about Better Grounds, and most importantly, we're going to leave you with some tips as to how we can, again, tweak that cup for the planet. David, I'm really excited to talk to you today. How are you?
I'm excellent. Thanks, Stephanie. Excited to talk to you as well. Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, your company, Better Grounds, solves a lot of problems for listeners like me who absolutely cannot do without their cup of coffee. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, tell us a little bit about Better Grounds, and tell us about how you decided, out of all the jobs on the planet, you were going to co found a subscription service for coffee.
It really started with my own aha moment, and that was going to a local cafe who was specialty coffee shop that had manual brew, pour over coffee that was very origin specific. And for me, coffee was coffee. Went to go to Starbucks, you get a dark roast coffee, that's great. But what a lot of us sort of uh, what some people don't know about, no, sorry. Um, so having that, what I used to like was dark coffee. And the thing with dark roast coffee is that really dark roast coffee tends to roast away all of that, unique flavor, all of the origin profile. And so I equated, dark roast to strong and bold coffee taste and light roast to really watery. So it was when I went to this, local specialty shop and had this really light roast coffee that was, made with care, and I just tasted this bouquet of fruit, and I could taste in it the blueberry and the lemon, and it was just a whole new experience, an aha moment, and that is really what set me on the coffee journey of, wow, I didn't know that coffee could taste like this. And now I want to see what the full, spectrum of possibilities are for coffee. So from a coffee, perspective, I used to travel a lot for work and travel personally. And, after trying that first cup, sort of made it a goal anywhere I went to sort of seek out, those coffee shops and to try new coffee. Coffee is such a community, and to talk to the people and to learn these very stories about not only the origin story of the cafe, but also to, hear them talk about their connection to, these farms and where these coffee came from and their enthusiasm about the different flavor profiles and the proximity. Just really, really, became enthralled with that community, became enthralled with those stories. And that just led to wanting to discover more and more coffee. We recently launched Better Grounds, which, as you mentioned, is an all organic specialty coffee subscription. Basically, what we're out to do is discover and partner with roasters across the country who are pushing for both a more environmentally as well as a more economically sustainable future in coffee.
Well, I think at least I can speak for myself. I love coffee, but I like what I like. And it took me a long time to find the bag that I like, my go to at the supermarket. And so the thought of changing such a deeply embedded routine, um, I don't like change. I like what I like and I want to stick with it. But I'm wondering if we could start this conversation by you telling me, teaching me and my listeners, like, what is it that we perhaps don't know about our coffee from an environmental perspective?
Yeah, great question. So you mentioned you like what you like, and what might we not know about our coffee that we typically are buying, at the grocery store or at the cafe. There are really four sort of considerations that would call attention to. One of those being quality. Alluded to sort of economic sustainability, health considerations, and then environmental sustainability, which is that last point that you hit on. So, sort of first talking about the environmental considerations that are at play. A lot of the coffee that we are seeing and buying in the supermarket on the shelves, or at sort of these more global chain cafes, this is commodity grade coffee or lower grade specialty coffee. So a lot of this is coming from large monocrop farms. And there are a whole host of negative unintended consequences that do come from that. So if we look at, say, the largest coffee producing region in the world, which is Brazil, similar to a lot of the other large scale agriculture that we have become very familiar with and aware of, large scale animal agriculture, coffee is a very similar story, where you have a lot of deforestation. And that deforestation is devastating to the root systems, to the ecosystems that surround those coffee plantations. That leads to things like soil runoff. Other challenges with that conventional coffee production is that when you do cut down your native forest and trees that surround coffee, coffee is meant to grow under a canopy of trees. So a lot of that shade that is provided by those canopy trees also protect coffee from invasive species like insects. So what happens when we're not only cutting down this land, but now all of a sudden there are complications with invasive species? So how do we combat those invasive species? We treat them with a whole host of chemicals, which includes pesticides and herbicides. A lot of us, it's easy to sort of be removed from the realization that coffee is an agricultural product. Coffee grows on a tree. It is a cherry that has to be harvested and pulled off that tree, just like the other fruit and produce that we consume. And unfortunately, conventional coffee is one of the most chemically treated crops in the world. So those chemicals, of course, permeate that soil. As the soil runs off, you have chemicals that are running off, which are getting into local water supplies, which are, of course, permeating the air. So negative health considerations for those farmers and farm workers who are handling the crops, who are spraying the chemicals, those in surrounding communities who are impacted by the air and the water that is now saturated with these chemicals. Then, of course, when it comes to us, there are the considerations of what residual chemicals remain in those cups. Being so heavily treated, one thing that is one thing you typically hear is that some of those chemicals are roasted off during the roasting process. However, there's no good regulation or standards to identify what residual chemicals remain in that cup that we're drinking every single day.
So, what are the price differences then? I know organic food is more expensive than its conventional counterparts. I tried my hardest to buy the organic food when I can afford it. Um, so, is there a big price difference when we're talking about organic or perhaps even fair trade coffee?
Great question. So, typically see a couple factors at play when we talk about price. So yes, so the fair trade and organic are both going to drive up price minimums. So one incentive for farmers to obtain an organic certification is that they are going to be able to obtain a higher price. So if we're talking first about commodity coffee, so this is coffee that, like a lot of the other largest agricultural products, wheat and soy, these are traded on the open market in really large lots by global buyers who are focused on keeping prices low. So when buying that commodity grade coffee, there is a premium that's assigned to organic coffee on that open market. Similar to fair trade, there are minimum prices set by the fair trade certification for the price of coffee at export. So you are going to, when comparing a comparable quality of coffee, if it is fair trade certified, if it is organic certified, there is going to be a little bit of an additional price tag on that coffee. The one sort of element then though that adds into that price scale becomes the quality component. So even when talking about organic, even when talking about fair trade, there is a wide gap between commodity coffee and then what we consider specialty grade. So as we talked about with commodity coffee, that's going to be those really, really large lots. So maybe there's a lot of coffee that's being brought simply from Brazil without much visibility, without much awareness of where is that coming from, what's the condition on those farms, what is the relationship between the buyers and those producers. Now, when we talk about specialty coffee is defined by the Specialty Coffee Association as any coffee that scores 80 points or above on a scale of 100. So a lot of what goes into that specialty grading is defects in the coffee, as well as the taste characteristics. So coffee that is grown at the right altitude, in the right conditions, in really healthy, nutrient-rich soil that's harvested at the right time is going to produce a much better taste experience than, say, that commodity coffee that is maybe not grown at the optimal conditions and is used, treated with chemicals and things of that nature to boost the yield of that coffee. So when we layer in that specialty component, that's where that price component becomes a sliding scale. So it's I would equate that to the majority of products that we find on the shelves. Right, there are a lot of really low cost products that are accessible to us today, but oftentimes we look at that end of the spectrum, and where are the low cost food items? These tend to be your heavily processed foods, right, where we don't have a good sense of where those ingredients are sourced from. So when we look at coffee, the way we like to think about it is that this is really like any other food. The produce that you buy, the fruit that you buy, this comes down to an investment in your health and understanding where that product came from, understand the impact that it had along the way for the entire supply chain, for the producers that are producing it, for the environment, as well as the health implications on us. That's where we start to look at the additional price of fair trade, organic coffee that is a higher quality, and start to feel good about that decision.
You've convinced me. You did it. Well, I should just say that a question I often ask myself when making a purchasing decision, not necessarily with just coffee, but with anything, is ask myself, is this too cheap? Like, who's paying for the cheapness here? Somebody or something is always paying that difference. So if you're used to buying a bag of coffee for $4, that to me sounds too cheap, right? There's so many moving parts that to grow coffee, roast coffee, ship coffee, to get it into your local supermarket, $4 doesn't seem to cover all those aspects. But you were mentioning the difference between, I believe, did you say commodity coffee and specialty coffee? Okay, so I have to ask you this question because you mentioned you were a home roaster. I can tell you just love coffee. Is there a huge difference in the taste? And I know you're going to say yes, but I guess a better way to ask this question would be, can somebody like me who likes coffee but is not an aficionado by any means, am I going to taste the quality difference?
Absolutely. So when we talk about quality in coffee, that flavor spectrum is extremely diverse. So what a lot of us don't realize is coffee actually has more flavor compounds than wine. So we think about the complexity of wine. We think about the different flavors and the different terroirs depending on where it's grown in the world. For all the wine aficionados out there, right? Depending on the year, sometimes you can mention the year and the place, and someone lights up, right? That was a great year. So I don't know enough about wine, but as it relates to coffee is more complex than wine when it comes to flavor. So each origin where coffee is grown based on the nutrients in that soil, based on that altitude that it's grown at, based on the variety of coffee, hundreds of varietals of coffee, within sort of broader categories of Arabica, Robusta. If we start to dig into Arabica, you have Catawai and you have Bourbon and you have Geisha. There's a whole world of these different plant species that are grown that on their own are going to produce a different flavor profile, and then the soil that they're grown in is going to produce a different flavor profile. So as you really start to explore coffee, which is so much of coffee is about exploration, and when you start to explore coffee and try different coffee from different regions, you start to pinpoint, and it takes you to that place where it was grown. A lot of times with coffees grown in African countries, Kenya and Ethiopian and Burundi coffees, you get maybe a little bit more acidity. They're a little bit brighter coffees. You can have very ripe sort of fruit flavors in coffee. Then you go to maybe Central America, and the flavor profile that's more characteristic is that round and mellow and chocolatey and nutty. So even though these descriptors, right, that we sort of see on a coffee bag can feel sometimes out of reach, when we do try those different coffees, it's really hard to miss those different flavors. But one thing to consider when we're experiencing that flavor is that coffee does go stale. So when we talk about quality, another component to better understand when we're making coffee purchasing decisions is, when was this coffee roasted by? If the roast date is on a bag of coffee, we want to try to buy coffee within the first 3 weeks of when it was roasted. So whole bean coffee starts to lose its peak flavor after 3 weeks of being roasted. Ground coffee really starts to lose a lot of its flavor compounds within an hour of being ground. So if we're drinking fresh coffee that is well sourced, that is more regionally focused, where it's going to retain a lot of that stronger origin character profile of the region that it was sourced from, we can really start to experience those unique flavors that individual coffees have.
What I love about talking to you is that I just get the passion in your voice. You clearly love coffee, and it makes me want to uh, love it as well. I usually use coffee as for the caffeine, right? Wake up, get my life together. But you're talking about flavor profiles. You're talking about different hints of this and that, and like, I'm on board. So, Dave, I want to talk to you about fair trade coffee, because I feel as though when it comes to fair trade, the two products that come to my mind is coffee and chocolate. So where does the fair trade certification fall in with this conversation? And what are your thoughts? If there's a fair trade logo on a bag of coffee, should we assume that um, that's where we should put our money, or am I missing something?
This really brings us back to the economic sustainability portion of coffee. So we kind of talked about, before mentioned 4 things to consider when we're thinking about where our coffee came from. And we talked a little about quality, talked a little bit about environmental sustainability. As we talk about economic sustainability, there has long been a price problem in coffee. So coffee prices are dictated by the commodity market. So, regardless of where the coffee is grown, regardless of the cost of living in those different countries, which may be very different in Colombia compared to in Burundi or somewhere in Indonesia and these different coffee producing regions, but we have global markets that dictate the price of coffee. And then as we look to assign premiums for quality or for organic or for fair trade, those premiums are based on that commodity price. Well, for a long time now, we are talking about this at an interesting time where, or with a lot of other inflation surrounding us, we've seen a spike in that commodity price, which is closer to $2 today, where as for number of years it has been nearly half of that. But that commodity price of coffee, the majority of coffee that's being bought, the price being paid, just simply does not provide for living wages for producers. Oftentimes, the price of coffee that actually, the amount of what's paid for coffee that actually makes it back to a farmer is lower than the production cost. So what we're finding in coffee is that it's not a viable business for a lot of people. So you have multi-generational farms where next generations, fortunately, have maybe opportunities for education or to move to a nearby city to take on different work. And they're starting to consider that more and more versus carrying the family farm forward, because prices paid simply don't provide for a high enough standard of living. So fair trade, was established to protect some of these prices and to establish a higher floor for the prices paid for a pound of coffee at export, to ensure that living wages were provided to producers who were selling their coffee on the open market. The challenge with fair trade is that oftentimes that price is just held below where the living wage price really needs to be. So currently, we actually have a fair trade price of $1.40 per pound that sits below the current commodity market price of $2 per pound. So while fair trade has done wonders to start the conversation, to raise concerns around prices paid, around labor practices, when you have low prices, that oftentimes has ripple effects, such as now we can't provide adequate wages for the farmers who are coming to help pick the coffee. That can lead to poor labor practices when prices paid aren't sufficient to producers. So fair trade was put in place to start the conversation, to raise awareness and try to address a lot of these issues. The challenge is fair trade, as mentioned, that price has just stayed too low, and is not dynamic enough to account for what the change in real living wages are. So what we like to talk to importers and roasters about, and fortunately there is a lot more increased awareness among the specialty coffee community, and a lot of the actors are going well above and beyond fair trade. So a lot of companies, in November, the roaster that we feature is Wonder State Coffee, and they are a part of a member-owned importer cooperative. And at the roaster level, as well as the cooperative level, they have set minimums of 50% above and beyond fair trade organic pricing as the floor for which they'll pay. So what they're recognizing is that, hey, studies show that the prices we're paying, even those dictated by fair trade, are not providing enough income to farmers, to farm workers. So for us to continue to have a mutually beneficial relationship where we can together produce really good coffee for all of us to enjoy, to provide for the livelihood of the millions of people who work in these remote rural communities and countries across the globe, in coffee plantations, that we just all recognize we have to be willing to pay more to support that. The last thing I'll sort of mention on fair trade is that when we look in coffee at a lot of the minimum prices set, so fair trade included in one of those, that is FOB, so free on board. So that is the minimum price that is expected to be paid for coffee at export. This coffee supply chain is incredibly complex and involves a lot of hands. So oftentimes you have actual farmers who may own, a few acres of land, and they, are harvesting, cherries from their coffee trees. Well, they're then selling into a cooperative who's pooling resources together and buying cherries from all of these smallholders, in their region. Those cooperatives then work with a processing facility to dry the coffee cherries, who then work with an exporter who has to work with an importer. So there are a lot of layers to the supply chain, a lot of people involved. And so while some of those price minimums are incredibly well intentioned, they only apply at export, and the amount of visibility that we have into how much of that is actually making it back to those farmers, those farm workers, it can sometimes be challenging.
So you bring up a lot of really important points there. I would say for myself and for my listeners who don't know half as much about coffee as you do, we would go to the store. We would perhaps, if we're trying to make an ethical purchase, well, we would look for the one with that third-party certification, the fair trade label. We would take it home and we would feel good about ourselves. But so then I have to ask, with all the pitfalls associated with the fair trade certification on coffee, how can we shop more mindfully for coffee? And I guess a better way to ask this question would be, how do you shop for coffee?
Excellent. Great question. So a few things that I would call out when shopping for coffee. I mean, it really all starts with seeking to understand where our products came from. So like we talked about with food and with our produce, the best thing that we can always do as a consumer is try to understand, where did this product come from? What's the impact that it had along the way? And with coffee, fortunately, we are seeing a lot more awareness and an increased interest in driving transparency, traceability, understanding where it came from, but also being able to show that and provide proof of that. So if one thing that is always, a good practice is to, find a brand that, you can know and trust that they are asking those questions, that they're doing that due diligence. To your point, the one thing that differs with coffee from produce is that a lot of us go to our local farmers markets, or can, and we can, talk to the farmers and we can ask about their growing practices. So even if they don't have a certification attached to it, they can tell us that they're not certified, but they can explain their farm practices. They'll invite us out, to see the farm if we're interested. We don't have that luxury. We can't travel to and talk to the farmer, in Ethiopia or Burundi. There's a little bit more of a barrier there. So how do we find the people who we're comfortable with knowing that they are doing the due diligence, so that when we buy that bag of coffee, we can truly feel good about not only the health implications for ourselves and the experience that we're going to have, but also that impact it had on the people and the planet along the way. There are certainly some key things that would call out and recommend listeners to look for. Organic certification is tremendous signaling, right? That's going to tell you that that coffee was grown without the use of those synthetic pesticides and herbicides that are harmful both to the environment, as well as to our health and the health of the people who are growing the coffee. Fair trade certification is still a good indication, right? I think with all certifications, they are not perfect, and our goal is to go above and beyond those certifications and really understand the practices that stand behind them. However, supporting certifications is signaling, right? So even if the fair trade minimum falls short, a coffee can be fair trade certified. It doesn't mean that that roaster did not go above and beyond and pay more than the fair trade. So by buying fair trade, we are still signaling that this is something the market cares about, that we are willing to pay a little bit of a premium to continue to support that. And so long term, supporting those certifications is going to drive good. Another thing to look for would be the region that the coffee was grown in. So if we just buy a bag of coffee and it just says Brazil across it, Brazil is by far the largest producing country in the world. Over a third of the coffee in the world is grown in Brazil. And unfortunately, when we talk about a lot of the ethical concerns around coffee, when we talk about a lot of the farm concerns around coffee, Brazil does not have the best of reputation, and a lot of that has been driven by the desire to decrease input costs, to feed low prices at the consumer level, which leads to the things like deforestation and using chemicals in an attempt to increase yield. So if we just buy a coffee that says this is from Brazil, we have no sense of what was the region that this came from, what were the conditions where it was grown, versus if we buy a coffee that says it was from a specific region or a specific co-op. That right there is pretty strong signaling that this was, a smaller lot that was purchased, or there is simply just more attention to, more visibility into where that coffee came from. So if a coffee talks about the farm or it talks about the region that it was grown in, that's both going to lead to a most likely more unique taste experience, but it's also a pretty good indicator that there was more thought put around how that coffee was purchased. We talked about roast date, looking for roast date. If you buy a coffee that is 2 weeks off of the roast date, well, odds are that the people who are sourcing and are roasting this coffee are also more thoughtful about other practices, because they care about that quality, they care about freshness. So that's a good indicator of what went into the sourcing of that coffee.
You gave so many really great tips, but the question that comes to my mind is, can we find the coffee that you've just so aptly described? Can the average listener find that coffee in their run-of-the-mill average supermarket?
Yeah, great question. So I think we're seeing more and more, local roasters who are, thoughtful about their sourcing and roasting practices, who are, partnering with grocery stores, and we're seeing more local coffee show up on the shelves. So, I think the buying and supporting, those local roasters, and again, being able to reach out and talk to someone about, where this coffee came from, the practices, but also accessibility. online. So has, of course, opened up a world to all of the people out there. And sort of what we found is that, kind of back to the experience of being able to walk to 4 cafes, or go to the grocery store and potentially get coffee from those 4 cafes, finding that coffee that met the intersection of both quality and sustainability can be really, really challenging. So sometimes, going out and finding those brands, finding those roasters who are doing better, who are driving towards that transparency, has never been more accessible than it is today.
So I want to talk to you about 2 more things. I want to talk to you about Better Grounds, but I also want to ask you how you roast your cup of coffee. Do you French press it? Do you, I don't even know. Do you have a drip machine? I want to know all of that because I've never talked to somebody who knows so much about coffee before, and I need to glean all the wisdom. So, but before we do that, let's talk about Better Grounds. I alluded to it being a subscription service. Talk to me about it. How does it work?
Great question. So what we're doing is we are talking to and partnering with roasters and importers who are sourcing this exceptional coffee that meets these different pillars of economic, environmental sustainability, as well as taste. Right. So not to lose sight of that, these are not only organic coffee that's also good for the people growing it, but these are exceptional coffees that provide for really, really unique taste experience. So we partner with a new roaster every single month, and our goal is to tell the story of that roaster, to tell the story of that coffee and where it came from. For us, coffee is just so much of a community and also an experience. So that getting a new bag of coffee with the branding from that roaster, learning about the farm that came from, really kind of takes us to a different place, right? And provides an experience of discovery. So our goal is to help people discover new coffees that might otherwise be really challenging for them to discover on their own, because not all of us have the time to ask all of these questions. So we want to be that source of due diligence for people, so that when you get a cup of coffee, not only is it going to be something that's new and unique and exciting to try, but also you can feel really, really confident in the health implications, as well as the impact that it had on the people and the planet along the way. So for subscribers, that means you can select the roast profile, can select whole bean or ground coffee, can select the quantity of coffee, and that's going to be delivered to you every month.
So, what I love about Better Grounds is that it solves a major problem for me as a consumer. I do not have time to personally vet the coffee that I'm drinking every morning. And so you're essentially doing that for me every single month. Tell me all about how you prepare your morning cup of coffee. Like, what do you do, and what can I do to make my morning cup of coffee taste better? Taste the best it can be.
Well, just like coffee is incredibly diverse, from a origin and flavor profile, the brewing methods are also just as diverse. So I will admit that I do. My wife does question my decision to bring additional coffee equipment in the house, because sometimes some say it looks like a chemistry lab. But part of the fun, and clearly I'm an enthusiast on a whole different level. But there are no shortage of brew methods. So depending on the day, I typically enjoy manual brew methods, which means grinding and heating, the kettle, gooseneck kettle, and, having a cone pour over cup that I'm, pouring my coffee over every day. So there's an AeroPress is a really interesting device that's very versatile that I'll use. A pour over is something that I really enjoy, but recognizing that we don't all have the desire or ability, right, to take the time in the morning to make a pour over cup of coffee. But the automatic, brewers, coffee pots have come a long way. French presses are, very easy to use, user-friendly tools. So really what's important is finding what you like. So, I tend to like a really clean cup. So if you're, having a pour over coffee that's going through a metal cone filter, that's going to filter out more of the oils and the compounds that might end up in a French press, which gives a French pressed a little bit more of a, rich, creamy mouthfeel and a little bit more body. So it comes down to preference and it comes down to time. When we talk about, the increased cost of drinking better quality coffee, one way that we can, reduce that cost is reducing waste. So, I think a lot of times there's a habit of building, brewing. And what I found for myself is that if I, get in the habit of waking up and I brew, a full pot of coffee, well, I might have a couple of cups off of that and I never get back to it. Then I find myself throwing out coffee. So that's what prompted me to switch to a more manual brew method was in order to reduce waste. But for, a household, where there are a lot of mugs being filled with the coffee pot, that's a great approach too.
Well, I must say, I would love to. Maybe you can take a picture of your chemistry lab and send it to me. I'd love to see. I'm over here thinking I'm, so smart and special with my French press, but you just put me to shame. Tell me where listeners can learn more about Better Grounds.
Absolutely. So we can be found at bettergrounds.co, that's .co, as well as follow us on Instagram at bettergrounds. And we absolutely love to talk coffee and want to hear from anyone else who's interested in talking coffee or has any questions. So it can always be reached at email. My email is dave@bettergrounds.co. And for any listeners who are interested in giving us a try, we have a promo code for podcast listeners, which is code minimalist. And with that code, listeners will be able to receive 50% off their first month's coffee of a monthly subscription.
Well, Dave, I want to thank you so much for coming on. You have given me a lot of excitement to do some things a little bit differently. I want to taste all the flavors in my morning cup of coffee. I want to, spend a little bit more. That's what this show is about, right? Quality. When we can spend a little bit more for our health, for the planet's health, we do it. We can't always do it necessarily, but when we can, you just did an excellent job giving us the why. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Stephanie. It's been great talking with you and appreciate you having me on.